Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the briefing room. My name is Eric Cavanaugh. I will be your moderator for today's event, in which we are going to get into a rather fascinating discussion about how to get strategic with your enterprise reporting and, of course, your analytics, two sides of the same coin, but two very different sides if you get right down to it. But there are a lot of similarities, of course. So the title today is A Strategic View of Enterprise Reporting and Analytics, the Data Funnel. We're going to be hearing from Jaspersoft and from our good friend Colin White of BI Research. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. This is a slide about yours truly, and enough about me. The mission of the briefing room, as many of you now know, is to really reveal the essential characteristics of these software packages. We do want to get down to the brass tacks and understand exactly how these things work, why they work the way they do, why they were designed the way they were, and how they interface with all the other products that you have out there. Obviously, we live in a very heterogeneous world these days, and I would argue that situation is getting more complex, not less complex, despite adherence to standards, of which there are quite a few, some more prevalent than others. Of course, things like SQL, we know are de facto standards, the structured query language, but we have a lot of this not only SQL stuff these days and new SQL technologies, and obviously they are changing the game for what's happening out there. We cover a different topic every month in the briefing room, with the idea being we're trying to give you as end users a strategic view of the vendorscape. So we know that when you are on the verge of purchasing one of these products, it is a very big decision. It's not a small thing. These technologies tend to be fairly expensive, especially when you talk about total cost of ownership. So we want to make sure that you have all the details you can possibly get in order to make an educated decision about which direction to go. So that's why we have different topics every month. And of course, for anyone who is new to this, we only broadcast the briefing room on Tuesdays at 4 Eastern Time. Same bat time, same bat channel. So the topic for this month is intelligence. Of course, business intelligence is an industry that has been in formation now for arguably 30 or 40 years. The moniker has been prevalent for the last 15 to 20 years, I suppose. Howard Dresner, back in his Gartner days, got credit for coining the term business intelligence. And then we also talk about analytics, and big data, of course, is the hottest topic of the month here. For anyone who would believe all the marketing hype, you'd think that big data is all the data that there is, and Hadoop is the ultimate tool to handle all of that, and obviously that is an exaggeration. But I will say that the movement toward open source adoption is a very significant one, and it's creeping all around the edges. We have a proponent of open source on the phone with us today, so we'll hear maybe a little bit about that. But it's certainly changing the game, and that's one thing that I think warrants us paying close attention to what the open source movement is all about and how it can benefit you out there in your organization. So we're going to talk about intelligence and analytics and how to get a strategic view on that whole process. So the analyst today is Colin White of BI Research. He is one of the true veterans in our space. We're very pleased to have him on board today. And just a reminder of the format, I go for just a couple of minutes giving you the overview. Then the vendor goes for 20 minutes and gives you a detailed look at their technology, what it does, why it works a certain way, so you can get a feel for where they're coming from and where they might fit into your application architecture. The analyst then gives a brief response, just for about 5 minutes or so, and then just starts asking questions. And we make sure that the analyst and vendor do not coordinate before these events, because what we're trying to do is reveal an organic, natural discussion between a vendor doing some interesting things and an analyst who knows the space. Because let's face it, those folks know which questions to ask. So I'm very pleased to have Karl Vandenberg here. He is the VP of Products and Alliances at Jaspersoft, so he is obviously a busy guy. I'm going to go ahead and hand the keys to the WebEx over to you, Karl. Just click anywhere on that slide and use the down arrow to move through your slides, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Eric, and good to be here today. This is my first briefing room, but I'm excited to be here and welcome all the participants on the phone. So we're going to talk, I'm going to walk through a number of slides. As I told Eric and Colin before we got on the phone here, my attempt was to make this a little bit more than just vendor specific. So I try to talk more broadly about some of the trends that we see at Jaspersoft and we're tracking in the business intelligence space. And then I will talk, of course, a little bit about Jaspersoft towards the end, but I'm trying to make this of more general interest to the audience. So the topic is getting to pervasive BI, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of the data funnel, and I'll start straight away with this promise of business intelligence. In saying that the business intelligence or analytics market is hot right now is an understatement. I mean, the fact that it's so hot, though, should really come as no surprise. In a world where information is the new currency, it's those become smartest at generating insights that are going to become the winners. And so if you think of Google or Facebook, LinkedIn, Zynga, these are all businesses driven by information. So given the promise of being able to generate more revenues, to save costs, to better engage customers and users, you'd think that every information worker inside a company or organization would have access to business intelligence today. The surprising reality is, and this has been true, as Eric has mentioned, I mean, the industry's been around arguably 30, 40 years. I mean, this percentage has not moved. 25% today, or a quarter of potential information workers who should have access to business intelligence do today. And so this is really a conundrum. The fact is that it's not that we're not spending enough. I mean, this is a number from IDC on what the market is expected to be this year. This is the analytics software market. This is just software and maintenance revenues, no services. The market is going to be about $34 billion this year. And to put that number in context, $34 billion, and that is more than a GDP of 100 of the world's countries. It's just a massive amount of money. And it's not that it hasn't been a focus. The focus here is clearly has been and continues to be a top priority for CIOs. So over the last few years, BI has ranked in the top priorities of CIOs, and Gartner's survey here of 2,300 CIOs worldwide confirms that, again, it is #1 this year. So if it's not money and if it's not focus, what is the problem? And the problem is that those who are supposed to be using these systems, so the business or end users, they're not self-sufficient. So the products that they're using are too complex to be intuitive or easily learned. They're typically being designed for a desktop experience, and so they're not readily accessible from whatever is the most convenient device, which is increasingly becoming a mobile one. And this is a really important point. They're not contextual. So what do I mean by contextual? It means that typically these applications are deployed separately. They're separate, standalone applications, reports, dashboards, and they're not integrated into the apps where users spend their workdays. So whether that be CRM app, the supply chain app, productivity suite, whatever it is, wherever the users spend their days, people do not typically spend their days within a BI system. You want the BI to appear. And so because it's a separate system, users tend to use the BI system only periodically at best. And in a word, these business users cannot self-serve. And so what this leads to is IT getting burdened with report requests, which in turn leads to a report backlog, and again, the business users becoming frustrated. And then on the builder side, and Jaspersoft, we refer to builders as those who build and deploy the BI systems. They can't easily scale, and that's both from a cost and an architectural perspective. And this problem is confounded when you consider what we call the new IT world. It is the world of cloud, mobile, and big data. So let's spend a moment and talk a little bit more about that. So here to start with a quote from Geoffrey Moore, who talks about some of the tectonic shifts that are happening in enterprise IT as a result of powerful global forces. You see some of them here. And really what that has done is it has affected three important dimensions. It's affected what users have come to require or expect from their applications. And this is not specific just to business intelligence, and this is true of any enterprise application. It's affected the technology that underlies that application, and it affects how the business thinks about and wants to purchase these applications. And on the user side, we capture this change with the word consumerization. So I think we've heard a fair bit about the consumerization of enterprise IT as a lot of components to it, but basically it means that users expect their enterprise apps to behave like their personal apps, whether it be Twitter or Facebook. And so it needs to be pleasing to the eye, it needs to be very interactive, and again, it needs to be contextual. So it needs to surface in the most convenient environment or the usual workspace of the user, not as a separate application. On the technology front, we've captured the changes with cloud. And what I mean by cloud here, I mean it in a very broad sense, so not just Amazon EC2. What I'm talking about here really is scale-out virtualized infrastructure. And that could be on-premises with a private cloud, or it could be a public cloud, or any flavors of the cloud, the different layers, infrastructure, platform, or application. But in general, the stack has really shifted from a client server to a very scale-out virtualized infrastructure. And now on the business front, what we're talking about here is cost. I mean, cost has become a top consideration for any IT purchase, and that manifests in terms of ROI or total cost of ownership or time to value. These are all metrics by which any IT purchase today is measured. So given the challenges we talked about and given the context of this new IT world, let's look at the vendor landscape today and how this is being addressed with how we're addressing these issues. So when you look at the MarketScape, you can see that you can start seeing why some of these issues of really getting to pervasive BI, which requires the addressing self-service and requires the ability to scale easily, why some of these issues are there. I mean, if you look at the top left, the sort of the platform vendors or mega vendors in this space, scale has certainly been their primary focus with large enterprise deployments. But even when you consider scale, and you could arguably say that they can certainly scale to all users, it's very doubtful that most businesses would be able to afford the cost of scaling to all users. So architecturally, yes, all users. Cost-wise, doubtful. In terms of the questions, certainly they can answer questions from most relational sources. But what about the newer non-relational ones, the NoSQLs, the Hadoops? And then when it comes to infrastructure, these platforms, which are often decades old, have been optimized, well optimized for traditional IT stack. But what about the new IT stack? Again, they're struggling to scale in this world of cloud and mobile and big data. On the self-service front, I mean, the vendors, if you look at what's really hot in the BI space right now, visualization is really where the action is at. And, for good reason. I mean, the visual metaphor certainly makes it easier for business users to understand and derive insight from data. So it definitely helps in terms of making business intelligence more self-service enabled. But heavy visualization really is not a suitable paradigm for most business users. So not every user is going to spend their day in a business intelligence environment, as we've discussed, and needs the full capabilities that are provided by these systems. So what you really are looking for is interfaces and designs that are suited to every level of user in the organization. On the device front, there's, again, some good progress being made in making these new visualization applications available on phones or on tablets. But again, the real problem comes down to how this surfaces, whether it be on the mobile devices or on the desktop, is that these typically surface as separate applications and not in the context of where the user wants to spend their day, which is not a BI application. And so what we're looking for, what we believe at Jaspersoft the solution is combining the self-service capabilities along all of these dimensions, any user, any device, in any context, with the ability to scale along the dimensions of getting to every user cost effectively, to be able to answer questions, whether they come from a traditional source or some of these newer sources, and then being able to scale out on both a traditional architecture as well as a cloud-centric architecture. And we call that self-service business intelligence at scale. I mean, that is, we believe, the key to pervasive BI. So I'm going to look at it now from a more of an architectural perspective. What you're seeing here is the traditional, what we call the traditional data funnel, which underlies a BI deployment. So the funnel is at the top end is wide because we're trying to convey here the ability to access data. And it gets more constrained as you move down the funnel to a casual user who really doesn't have need to be able to explore and browse a very wide data set. They are presented with something that is more constrained. Interestingly, the pyramid is really the inverse shape when you come to user deployment, because obviously you're going to get a lot more casual users using the BI system than developers involved in it. But from a data funnel perspective, we start with a traditional funnel. There's data production, which is where the actual data is being produced. Today, typically smaller in scale, largely structured data, and largely on-premises. The manipulation of data is typically, again, done in a relational database and using ETL, or data integration methods, and SQL as the language to do that. The data analysis happens. A lot of OLAP out there using certainly metadata to enable that. And then the familiar interfaces of pivot tables, and then MDX is the query language for more of the sophisticated OLAP style analyses. And then on the data viewing front, production reporting, static largely in nature, dashboards, and then access from a desktop and a browser. So that's how the traditional data funnel looks. And along with all of those, you see the typical users, developer, data architect, and data analyst, as someone has noted, does have a drink, because I think that's probably one of the most fun jobs. And then the casual users forming the constituents who are participating in this data funnel. So when we look at the requirements that we talked about at scale and self-service, how does that affect the data funnel? And so on the scale front, it affects the data production in that we move from small structured data sets being produced to very large scale data that is not only structured in nature, but multi-structured, semi or unstructured in nature. We move from data that is largely on-premise to data is increasingly available as a source in the cloud. And then on the data manipulation front, we move from traditional databases, relational data stores being the primary store for this data, to, because of the nature of this new data production, so being very large in scale and multi-structured in nature, we're having to accommodate that with new data stores. So analytic databases, both MPP style, columnar, you're, I'm sure, familiar with these new data stores, largely relational in nature, that are very good at processing at high speed large volumes of data, but not really optimized for the multi-structured data that we're seeing evolve. And that's where you get Hadoop and some of the NoSQL data stores that are being developed to cope with that. And now on the data, the way that you interface, again, with those data stores is changing. So certainly ETL and SQL continues to be present, but a lot of these new data stores don't have a SQL interface. And so what you're seeing here is really the application and scripting, whether it be Perl or Python or JavaScript, scripting happening inside the application that is doing some of the data manipulation, because these data stores are typically not very mature and can't do some of the complex aggregations that a SQL store can. So scripting is becoming a much more common method to engage in data manipulation. So that's the scale, how scale has affected the data funnel. And when then we look at self-service, we see that there are changes here too. So certainly OLAP and metadata continue to be important. We're increasingly seeing in-memory technologies enabling an easier and better data analysis experience, both in terms of the setup, because it's less complex to set up, and you can more quickly sort of do interactive analysis with an in-memory engine, because you don't have to build and maintain cubes. Certainly, you don't have to invest as much time upfront to get that data in a form that's accessible and easily usable by an analyst. And then, as we talked about, visualization is becoming a very important way to broaden the appeal of analysis, or the ability for users to get insights from data. And then on the data viewing, so at the very end of the funnel here, where the data is most constrained, but it has the broadest reach. So casual users forming, typically 80 to 90% of a business user population. What you're seeing, and we talked at the very beginning, Eric introduced this as kind of the shift of enterprise reporting or reporting. This is where we see the biggest shift, is that reporting is, in recent times, has been largely static in nature. If you think of production reports being pixel perfect, print ready, and available in PDF or even printed, moving to very much an interactive, web-based or mobile-based experience. So highly interactive, still can look pretty and be pixel perfect in nature, but very interactive in the ability for the user to sort, filter, move things around, and do so at high scale in terms of the number of users accessing the system. And then the contextual piece, which is, again, very important, is that typically a user will want to see that interactive report or dashboard in the context of the workspace or application where they spend the majority of their day, and not have to go to a separate BI system. So it's about bringing BI to the user in their context, as opposed to expecting them to go and log into a separate system every time they have a question. And then, of course, mobile access. So being able to get to this from any device, whether it be a desktop or a phone or a tablet. So I'm going to quickly move the last couple of slides, and then we're going to get into some discussion and a presentation from Colin. So I want to give you a couple of examples on these dimensions of self-service and scale, where Jaspersoft is working today. So when we if you remember those three dimensions of any user or any device in any context, so what it means, first of all, on the any user means that what a data analyst sees is going to be different from, and I'm not getting the slide build, Eric, so I'm going to have to, I realize now I'm going to have to talk through. So I'm going to ask the audience to imagine at this point some of the other components, and maybe we can I can get back to it if we can do some magic here later on. But I wanted to walk you through some of the different interfaces that a business user would see. So this is the screen of a sort of ad hoc analysis tool that we have. It's web-based in Jaspersoft. I have another screenshot, you'll have to imagine it, that's of a pixel perfect production report that is also interactive, and it will be very typically used by an operational manager. And then a dashboard, if you can imagine a dashboard here, an interactive dashboard would be used often by an executive type. So the point is here that one size does not fit all, and not all users need all the capabilities of an analysis tool. And it's important to present in a consistent manner, but to present these capabilities, the right set of capabilities to the right user profile in order to get to pervasive BI.
And one thing, real quick, one thing we can do after maybe we have Colin speak, if you can gear up this deck on your desktop and open it up, I can actually do a screen share with you so you can walk through that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that once Colin is working through his slides. So, so then on the devices, of course, Jaspersoft is built to support any device, whether it be a browser or a tablet or a phone. And we enable that both through browser access as well as native access. And then the context piece, and this is where I most wanted to show you, Jaspersoft is currently embedded in about 130,000 applications worldwide that are in production. And so we surface really in everything from education apps to financial services apps to apps for the building industry, construction industry, really any conceivable application Jaspersoft surfaces, and that has been a big focus for the company to bring business intelligence to users in the context of the apps where they spend their day, as opposed to, again, having to go to a separate application. And then on the scale piece, that was a self-service. On the scale piece, there are really three components when we think about scale. It's scale in the cloud, scale for big data, and scale on mobile. And so Jaspersoft has focused a lot on scaling in the cloud. We have partnerships with Amazon, Red Hat, and VMware. Amazon were available on their marketplace. Some of you may be aware they launched a new marketplace called the AWS Marketplace. So you can get Jaspersoft for free today on that marketplace. And that's really more for a business user who wants to deploy in the cloud. And then if you're a developer, some of you may be familiar with Platform as a Service, which is really abstracting the middle layer of the application stack, so the databases and the message bus and the application server. Jaspersoft is today the first and only business intelligence vendor that is available on Red Hat's OpenShift, which is their platform as a service, and VMware's Cloud Foundry, which is VMware's platform as a service. So again, serving both developers and business users in the cloud. And then on the big data front, we have a lot of partnerships, both in the traditional sort of analytic databases like Greenplum or Vertica, HP's Vertica, as well as the supporting the major distributions of Hadoop, like from IBM's Big Insight or Cloudera's distribution, as well as the new flavors of database, sort of so-called NoSQL databases like Mongo and Cassandra. And then on mobile, we have the ability, as I mentioned, to work both in the Android and in the iOS environments. And we're the first and only open source toolkit for Android or iOS developers so that they can build in business intelligence into their native applications using Jaspersoft technology. So last two slides here, just quickly on the company. So all of this summed up, we believe that has helped Jaspersoft really build a large community and customer base. We're deployed in tens of thousands of organizations worldwide. You know, not surprisingly, have a very large ecosystem because of our open source nature, about 16 million product downloads, about 3,000 new ones every day. We have over 250,000 BI builders in our community, and a total of 175,000 production deployments worldwide. Most of those are in our community, but we still have a large customer base of 15,000 customers. These are paid customers that are really in every industry, as you can see on the slide. And then finally, this has really fueled Jaspersoft growth. So we've continued to grow at high double digits, and our growth rate continues to accelerate and being recognized. Most recently, I don't have it up here, a Red Herring America's 100 Award. We won the Cody Award for Best Open Source Solution this year, and Best Cloud Solution in 2010, and then we were the first open source, pure open source BI provider on the Gartner Magic Quadrants. So that's it from me, Eric. So I'm going to hand it back to you. I have a conclusion slide. I'll leave it up here as we're making the transition, but really is recapping on the things that we talked about of changing and scaling true self-service BI to lead to pervasive BI and the changes that we talked about are required in the data funnel.
Okay, great. And let me see. I'll go ahead and push Colin's first slide here, and then Colin, I'm going to hand you the keys to the WebEx car. If you just click on that slide anywhere and use the down arrow, or you can actually use the thumbnails and go straight to those slides you wanted to talk about. So go ahead.
Okay. So thanks, Karl. That was a great presentation. What I want to do, if you've downloaded the deck, you must probably will see more deck slides there than I'm going to present. I want to get to the Q&A because I think that's what makes these sessions really interesting. But to set the scene for the Q&A, I just want to use a couple of the slides from the deck that people will have downloaded. If we go back to what Karl was talking about, he was talking about self-service at scale, and I really like that concept because I think we've talked about self-service a lot, but we've tended to just talk in terms of making everything usable and making information more consumable. But I think we have to take into perspective the fact we've also got scalability issues, and I think the issues are summarized here in that we are seeing huge data growth in our organizations, increasing number of data types and data sources, particularly in the area of multi-structured data, of course, and that's led to the concept of big data. To me, big data is not just about multi-structured data. It's not just about Hadoop, as Eric has said. I think it's about a lot of the workloads we can now support that we couldn't support before. In other words, we can do things now that we couldn't do before, even with our existing data. And then what's exciting, of course, is we've got a whole bunch of new data sources. At the same time, as Karl mentioned, we've got limited self-service, and that's partly because of tool complexity. And the thing is, we're trying to improve the pervasiveness of BI through self-service, trying to do it at scale to support this growth. But meanwhile, we've got restricted IT budgets, and meanwhile, in the current sort of climate, financial climate, we're trying to become more reactive to business needs. So we have this sort of contention going on in the marketplace. And if I sort of look at where the marketplace is heading, there's this big focus around big data and advanced or smart analytics, whatever you want to call it. As I said, I think it's not just about data volumes. It's about really what we're going to do with the data. It's the kind of very more sophisticated analytical facilities we have, which enables us to build more advanced applications, and of course with a variety of different types of data. And we are going to be using relational products that have been optimized for analytical processing. We are starting to implement non-relational systems like Hadoop. At the same time, we're trying to reduce costs. As Karl said, one size doesn't fit all. I think we're trying to extend the data warehousing environment by optimizing systems for particular solutions, trying to exploit hardware, often using packaged appliances to do that. And at the same time, we are trying, with this tremendous scalability issue, we're trying to provide faster time to value, self-service BI, the cloud, and of course many of the agile concepts that are out there apply to business intelligence and data warehousing. So I now want to move on and discuss this whole business of self-service at scale with Karl. And I tend to think of this discussion in terms of an information supply chain. In other words, it's not just about nicer user interface. It's not just about data visualization. We have to make the whole information supply chain more usable, more self-service for all the various BI and data warehousing users. And we have to support new data sources, new analytical techniques, new deployment platforms like the cloud and so on. And so if we look at this supply chain, we can break self-service BI, I think, into 4 areas. One is we need to make it easier to access data for analysis. We are starting to connect to big data. We're starting to use virtualization concepts by which we don't have to bring data into the enterprise data warehouse before we can analyze it. We're deploying analytical applications on appliances, packaged hardware and software. Some of those appliances use relational technology, some of those appliances use non-relational technology, again, to improve self-service, to faster deployment. We're starting to use cloud technology, both on-premises, on private clouds, and out in the public internet. I think Karl mentioned Amazon, for example. Where we've tended to focus, I think, where many of the BI vendors are focused, is on making the BI tools easier to use. And that's everything from, advanced visualization, easier data mining, customizable widgets that we can deploy to portals, and so on. And that's a key piece, but as I said, there are other pieces to self-service BI. The other one, and I think that's probably one of the most important ones, is making the BI results easier to consume by this vast set of business users really wanting to support more casual task worker type of people. That's where mobile computing sometimes comes in. We're trying to use easier user interface through things like Office and so on. And of course, we're also, for perhaps some of the more sophisticated users, trying to connect BI with collaborative capabilities. So younger people coming into the workforce start to see some of the tools they're familiar with in their personal lives in the business. So if I try and summarize then where we're at, and this provides sort of the framework for the discussions with Karl, is that, how do you provide the right solution? One size doesn't fit all. On the left-hand side, we've got all these increasing data sources, data volumes. We've got new analytical techniques. We've got multiple deployment platforms, including appliances, Hadoop, in the cloud. And then outbound, we've got multiple devices in multiple formats. So what I'd like to start asking Karl some questions, and I'm going to break it into these 4 areas of making it easy to use, making it easy to access data, making data warehouse environments faster to deploy, making BI tools easier to use, and then lastly, making the results easier to consume. So let's look at easier data access. Karl, Jaspersoft, and in your presentation, you talked about non-relational systems or NoSQL systems like Hadoop. What kind of connectivity to provide there, and how are Jaspersoft customers starting to use sort of systems like Hadoop and blend it with structured data? What kind of capabilities do you provide, and what are people using those capabilities for?
Great. Well, nice presentation, Colin. I hadn't had the opportunity to see your slides beforehand, but maps very nicely in a self-interested way to how we view the world. So I really like how you've structured and broken down the different components in the information supply chain. So to get to your question, how do we handle the newer flavors of data, and what our customers are doing and community doing with that? I'd start at the high level, which is kind of technology use cases. So how we see people setting up their environments to handle big data specifically. And there are 3 use cases that we talk about. One is probably the most common in the BI space today, which we call indirect batch analysis. And if you could imagine, if I could draw for the audience here, it's essentially a BI system sitting up on top of a data mart and using ETL to source from some of these new data stores, Hadoop being a very typical one. And that is a very common technology or architectural solution to get big data into a model where a typical BI system can handle it, because you're just really interfacing with the data store. And we see our customers and community using analytic databases often as the sort of the data mart. We have a number of customers using Vertica, for example, and Hadoop as a way to handle that, and using ETL or ELT to get the data from the Hadoop system into the analytic database. So that's the first use case, and again, I said it's probably the most common one we see today.
If I look at this chart that I've just put up, then the way I see the world is that, top left, we've got our traditional enterprise data warehouse, and on the right-hand side, we've got what I would call these investigative and built-for-purpose systems, which could be non-relational or analytical DBMSs. So use the
Yes.
example of Hadoop and Vertica, you see that blue box of analytical applications being Jaspersoft, and you're providing connectivity both to something like Vertica or a Hadoop-type system, and then you may be using ETL to move data between the systems. Is that correct?
Yes, that is. So that's kind of one use case. And if I look at your diagram, it's using if in that top right, if your non-relational system moves to the left into the analytic database, and then you're using Jaspersoft as your blue box there to access the analytic database. That's very common, and that the bi-directional error you have between the analytic database and non-relational system is typically ETL or just simply EL, so loading it into the analytic database. And that's the most common, and it is most common, as I said, the primary reason because you don't need to do anything different in your BI system because you're really just running on top of an analytic database which is relational in structure and uses SQL. The less common one, simply because it requires non-traditional access methods, is what we call direct batch reporting. So this is, if you think of it like an operational reporting of old on a relational system where the analytic application is going directly against the the operational data store. In today's world, when you have these new data stores like Hadoop HBase, which is a key value store in the Hadoop framework, or MongoDB, which is a document data store. These do not have SQL, they're not SQL or relational in structure, and they don't have SQL interfaces. They don't even have JDBC connections. So the only way that you can do that operational type reporting is you have a native connector that understands and interprets the bits and bytes in that data store and translates it into a relational model. And Jaspersoft has connectors that allow us to do that natively. So it's basically operational reporting. And then the third use case is
that reporting would be against data in a non-relational system, which may be multi-structured in nature.
Exactly. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So of course, the results will depend on what you've stored in there. But you can imagine, log files, for example, is very common in a Mongo system, which really is powered high throughput web applications. But there's no concept in Mongo, obviously, of SQL, and so the only way to interrogate that data store is if you've written your own language to query that data store, and that's what Jaspersoft has done, both for Mongo and Cassandra and Hadoop HBase and others. And then the third use case we call live exploration. And this is, again, depends on, in some cases, native connectivity. So let's talk about Hadoop for a moment, because the Hadoop framework is most of the access methods today from a BI system would be through Hive, which is SQL-like language into a relational data store in the Hadoop framework. The problem with Hive is that it's high latency, so it doesn't allow you for really responsive query times.
It's essentially batch process, isn't it?
Exactly, it's more batch processing. So it's good for the batch analysis or batch reporting. But if you want to do live exploration, the way that Jaspersoft does it today is that we connect through HBase. If you've got your data stored in HBase, which is a low latency connectivity, but again, it's non-relational, non-SQL. So you pull data directly into our in-memory engine through HBase. So you don't have latency in the back end, and you don't have latency on the front end with our in-memory engine. You basically pull in a snapshot, and you can do your browsing there. So it's more for a data analyst or data scientist type who wants to browse the data in the data store. And
that in-memory engine would support many users. In other words, it's a server-based engine.
Yes, it's not a desktop. It's server-based. Today, our in-memory engine certainly is not of the scale that it could handle an entire big data set, but realistically, there really aren't many offerings today that can get to that large scale. What you're really doing is you're taking you're using a query to essentially get the snapshot that you want to browse, and that can be handled in the in-memory engine.
Okay. So they're the three main.
So those are technology architectural setups, if you will. And in terms of what are people trying to do? I mean, it really is varied. I would characterize and give you a sense of where our community and customers are today. So we a couple of months ago launched a big data index, and that really tracks downloads. It's available, publicly available on our site if you go to jaspersoft.com/bigdata. And it's an interesting data point for the industry because it provides the downloads from our community of their most preferred big data connectors. So it essentially tracks downloads of our big data connectors, and we've had about 20,000 downloads so far of those connectors. And we kind of track which connectors are of most interest to our community, and not surprising, Hadoop is certainly up there. Mongo and Cassandra are also in the top three. But in spite of that, huge interest, I would say a lot of customers and community members are in the experimental phase. So trying to figure out, how do I leverage these new data stores to analyze this data that I've kind of been interested in analyzing, whether it be from social media, whether it be kind of weblogs, whether it be stock trades or high volume transactions. So both kind of the multi-structure in nature and large in size. And they've had this idea of wanting to do that, but haven't had the technology or the budget, because to be able to do this in a traditional store obviously requires large sums of money typically. So big part of the reason that big data has become so important and such a prevalent trend is that these data stores are open source. So they're freely available, and it can be used at no cost. And so we're seeing
that sort of leads me on to my next question, which is, given we're trying to reduce costs, we're trying to support scalability, we're trying to improve self-service. You mentioned the cloud a lot. I mean, how many of these applications, I mean, you've got two things you can do in the cloud. One, you can store the data there, and two, you can run the app there. So a lot of these experiments going on inside the cloud?
Yeah, I would say cloud lends itself very well. And when I talk about cloud, it's that kind of scale-out virtualized infrastructure. And that could be something you're managing on-premise in a private cloud. But certainly the idea that these data stores are built to scale out, these new data stores, whether it be Hadoop or Mongo or Cassandra. That's their model, scale out and commodity hardware. And so naturally the cloud infrastructure lends itself very well to that scale out model. And Amazon has really made a business for itself with EC2 and the rest of its AWS services, enabling it, making it very easy and very cost effective for companies of any size and any budget to get started with big data because of the scale out infrastructure at low cost.
Okay, and it's interesting about one thing I picked up on, which I thought was interesting, that doesn't get as much attention as I think, if we go now outbound from the warehouse, outbound from the BI tools, you mentioned multiple formats, multiple devices, and of course mobile is a key piece here. And you mentioned in passing about the existing pricing models, from my perspective, particularly are broken in the sense if you're trying to now deploy this to hundreds or thousands of users, then a per user pricing isn't going to work, is it?
No, absolutely. And I would say the consumerization of IT also carries down to this and what people are prepared to pay for their applications. And they're much more demanding of their vendors than they have been in the past. And certainly open source has driven this from a vendor perspective, has driven costs down, has certainly helped accelerate this commoditization trend. Cloud also, in terms of how the model is being priced, which is usage-based or utility-based pricing model. And so we're not only are we seeing the delivery model changing from on-premises to cloud and to embedded, but we're also seeing the pricing models changing to be much more subscription, or server or CPU or usage-based than user-based, which is the traditional model.
Mm-hmm. And, talk about mobile a little bit. I mean, if you look at the users of BI, we've kind of got our sort of business analysts and data scientists and managers. But isn't it the case, really, we want to push BI out more towards casual users or task workers? And do you see, where do you see sort of visualization and portals and mobile fitting in there and enabling us to do that?
Yeah, and going back to what I said about scaling that self-service piece, I think this is clearly one of the most important points of getting BI into the hands of more users. And so mobile certainly plays an important part of that because everyone today has a smartphone, at least in the countries where BI is prevalent, or a tablet, and so these are becoming the preferred interfaces for accessing any application, and business intelligence is no exception. And I think the beauty of what mobile will do for the BI applications is that it kind of forces you to be very conscious about how you design the reports and dashboards and the interfaces, because you have a lesser real estate, certainly on the phone, but also true on the tablets. So I think it's good.
The point here is that you're not just going to repurpose existing apps. You're going to
correct.
Have to for those. Yeah.
Correct. And going back to this point of context, so it's one thing that I didn't see in your, and admittedly it's something that we've thought about a lot, but I didn't see in your information supply chain. I would reemphasize this point of context, which is you think of any business user, in a company, and I said 95% of them are going to spend their days in some application that is not a BI application. And so really the question is, how do you get BI to them as opposed to expecting them to go to BI? And this is a little bit of my kind of standing on a soapbox and talking about this, and there's, of course, some self-interest as they're very good at it. But really, I think this is key because, this has been plagued me since I've been in this industry for nearly 2 decades now, which is, expecting users to go to a separate system every time they have a question just isn't realistic. So you've got to surface business intelligence inside the context of their applications. And that increasingly becomes important on mobile devices. People will have their preferred applications, which again will not be typically BI, but you want to surface analytics at the right time, to the right user profile with the right capability set inside their preferred application.
Okay. Now, Eric, I see lots of questions coming in. Do you want to switch to the questions coming in, or do you want me to keep asking questions?
I can maybe just queue up one more one that you really want to ask, and in the meantime, I'll throw out some questions from the audience. And I'd like to go ahead and put up your funnel slide here, Karl. And Karl, if you want to queue up that deck so you can do that build you talked about, feel free to do that, and then I'll hand it over to you in a second. So let me throw a couple questions over to you. A lot of good ones in the Q&A already. Thank you very much for these folks. I love this wording. So one of our attendees writes, surely big data is a full contact sport requiring data professional intervention, not an end-user casual tool, right?
So just to make sure I understand the question is big data is more for a technical user than a casual user. Is that?
Yeah, in other words, you need to be a professional to be messing around with big data.
Yeah, certainly when it comes to manipulating, Hadoop or writing MapReduce jobs to process in the Hadoop framework, it's definitely, a technical user. And that's why in our data funnel, it's really kind of in the domain of developers or data architects at that level. I mean, that's really not the purview of a casual user. By the time that, it doesn't mean that the end user or the casual users don't get access to that data. It's just by the time they've gotten access to it, as the data funnel suggests, that data has been constrained and really the complexity has been masked, and it's now presented in the form of a report or dashboard.
Okay, yeah, good. And in fact, one of the case studies you talked about, in fact, was really batch operational processing against sort of big multi-structured data. Those batch jobs will be pre-configured, they will be pre-optimized, and the results of that batch processing could be delivered to business users.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the end result is, the business users need to get the data that they're going to make their decisions on. And often and increasingly nowadays, that data is sourced from a big data system that's multi-structured in nature. By the time it gets to them, though, that's been, pretty much masked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, good. I got a couple more good questions here. And Karl, I'll pass the keys to you. And if you want to upload that other deck, or you could just do a screen share as well. But you should look at the quick start top left of your webcast console. It says share a file. So you can go ahead and share that right now if you want. And you could do that while I'm throwing another question at you, if you can multitask.
Okay. So I'm just going to do open and share is essentially what you asked me to do. And I'm going to look for that file now and then
exactly.
share briefly. I'll be able to do that.
All right. And then actually maybe I'll throw just this question over to you for comment, Colin, while Karl is digging that up, because it's a good point here. Let's see. Well, one of the attendees is talking about the importance of context, and that requires a surrounding infrastructure. Do you want to talk about just a second here, Colin, the importance of having context in this concept of a data funnel?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go back to one of my slides, I sort of, and let me see if I can find it here. If I go back to this one, under making BI results easier to consume and enhance. Can you see that slide?
Sure, it's faster time to value.
And so it is things like, I put in there data lineage, business glossaries. I think people are looking to see the information in context. And so, I think we're getting beyond the point where we can simply just dump information on people. We have to put it into context. We can make it actionable with alerts and recommendations, decision workflows. We can tie it to business glossaries. We can tie it to data lineage so we can go back and see where the data came from and what was done to it. And to me, that's the way I sort of view context. So I think it's this concept of if we build it, they will come. I don't think that works anymore. Just delivering nice, pretty charts and that on a end-user interface doesn't necessarily work. The information has to be consumable, and to be consumable, it has to be put in context, I think. Yeah.
Okay, good point. And Karl, I see you got a new deck up there.
Yeah, and it may be because I'm recognizing now that this is, I think it converts to PDF, so I think, are we going to suffer from the same problem? We might, yeah. So
okay,
we should have checked this before. And so no worries about it. I think I talked to it enough, and the slides, I think, are available are they available in PowerPoint form? Or is it going to be PDF?
If you, after the show, why don't you send it to us, and what we'll do is we'll put that, we'll link it to the episode page.
Okay.
So let me jump into this one. Here's a really good question. One of the attendees writes, all of this up and down across the board access to such a wide variety of data sources and pipeline stages requires a truly enterprise-wide metadata management protocol. How do you deal with that at Jaspersoft? How does metadata fit into your architecture?
That's a very good question. And I think, we are at the beginnings of a long road here, as is the rest of the industry, because really your questioner has hit the nail on the head in terms of the end goal is to have a unified metadata layer that can go across not only traditional relational sources, but many of these non-relational stores that are emerging. So at Jaspersoft today, we have a couple of layers in our metadata infrastructure. So we have metadata, and the same interface is used to access non-relational data. So it appears to the end user as metadata. So simple terms that they can manipulate and ask questions of Cassandra or Mongo or Hadoop. We have the same interface that you can use to access relational sources through a more sophisticated metadata layer that goes against relational sources. Those metadata layers are not are not unified. They're unified in the interface, but they're not unified in terms of how your user or your questioner is asked the question. But that is ultimately the goal, and that's what we're working towards, which is having a unified metadata layer that can span any of these data stores. And not only from a metadata layer, but I think you have to look at the performance as well. How can you pull data from all these different systems and get reasonable response time when you bring them together in the BI application? And there's a lot of work happening in our platform around caching and in-memory capabilities and data virtualization that is going to enable us to do that.
Yeah, I was going to say data virtualization. It sounds like what you're talking about. Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to say one interesting thing here. It's the Hadoop Summit this week in San Jose, and that's where I'm just about to head to, in fact. But one thing that was being announced this week is it's an open source project from Apache called HCatalog, and what HCatalog does is bring metadata from things like Hive and Hadoop and other systems running on Hadoop systems to bring it into a common catalog. And I think that will be quite good in the sense that we'll start to see some integrated data on the open source non-relational side that can be exploited by people like Jaspersoft. I don't know if Jaspersoft has done anything in that area.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we essentially have our own HCatalog right now, and because it didn't exist for the Hadoop world until recently. And so what we'll do is we'll progressively move to absorb HCatalog. Can't do all the things that we can do today, so we're going to wait for it to mature a little bit. But essentially, that's a good direction that the industry is taking, because there is an understanding you need that unified metadata layer.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of metadata, obviously metadata management tools, most of the ones in the marketplace today were designed for dealing with this highly structured world that business intelligence covers, transactional data, customer data, this kind of thing. Whereas a lot of this big data that we're talking about is structured differently. It's not to say that it's unstructured, because almost all data is structured in some sense. It may not be modeled very well, but it seems to me that one of the key ingredients to achieving this kind of funnel you're talking about, with the robustness that all these end users want and the kind of integrity that you need, would be to have some way to tie in an ontology of sorts to that metadata management layer. Is that something that you guys are working on, or can you speak to the value of having an ontology like that?
An ontology, yeah. I think that is the sort of the next level, and so the concept of kind of industry or functional specific semantics that is brought to bear on the metadata, I think, is a really good idea. And we have partners that do that. We work closely with some of them actually to develop some of our big data connectivity. And I think that's a great direction that the industry could take to make it much easier. It's not something that is in our immediate roadmap, but certainly in our longer term plans.
But Eric,
okay.
is it worth mentioning, if you work in the unstructured world and the content management world, they've been developing taxonomies and ontologies for years. And in fact, that's what faceted search engines use. Would you agree that as we move towards more self-service, we've got these structured query type interfaces, but the other way of improving self-service is to put search interfaces
yes.
on front of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Search interfaces on the front. I've always been a big believer in the Google, the simplicity of that Google approach to getting access to data. And not only on the front end, but also on the back end, where you're using search indexing techniques to tag and retrieve data. So we actually have support for Solr, which is the Lucene interface. Lucene being the open source search engine that some of your audience may be familiar with.
Yeah, a number of people are using Lucene now. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So we have support for that today, and in fact, some of these NoSQL data stores like Cassandra is building in support for Lucene, because they recognize that it's a great, search paradigm is a great way to give people access to unstructured data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the sort of the holy grail now, is to unify all this stuff. Let me go ahead and throw another good question. We got a couple more here. We'll go a little tiny bit long. One of the attendees writes, many vendors are touting data labs for self-service provisioning and use by the business. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on that trend?
Data labs, I'd have to, if that's another word for a sandbox, I'd have an answer for it. Yeah. So yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there are certain business user profiles. So the data scientist is kind of maybe the trendy one that's emerging. I just think of sort of the old SAS statisticians, but kind of the newer breed of that, or the data analyst, or an advanced data analyst. Definitely have a special need for really unbridled access to these new large or big data stores, big data sources. And so setting up a sandbox makes a lot of sense. So that really, for anyone who's not familiar with the concept, is really setting up a high performance, wide open access to a large data source so that the data scientists or data analysts can kind of browse the data. And that's the use case that we talked about. Our structure is really you're pulling into our in-memory engine, and you're using then our analysis interface to go against the in-memory engine. But there's other ways you can do it, and some of our customers I mentioned do that on Vertica, as a data mart where they put the data in Vertica and then let the data analyst or data scientist to go directly against Vertica using Jaspersoft.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that the concept of a data lab is a sandbox, but it's a managed sandbox. In the words, you spin out a sandbox, but it only exists for a certain period of time, after which it's deleted, and then you start looking at what people are doing with it to make sure people are using it. So I think that it extends the sandbox into more of a managed environment. I think.
Managed, yeah. Or throwaway, managed disposable environment.
Yeah. And that's my investigative data platform on my little chart that we looked at earlier on. Yeah.
Oh yeah, good point. Well, we've got a couple more good specific questions here, and then we'll wrap up. Here's a really good one, Karl. One of the attendees writes, in healthcare, both on the payer and provider verticals, we are finding that the questions that need to be addressed and utilized are being driven much further down in that data funnel. Dashboards and static reports are not sufficient. So here I'm sure he's talking about drill through. Can you kind of talk about that and how you enable that deep type of drill through with this funnel approach?
Yeah, and for us that really manifests at the data analysis layer. So through in-memory, pivot tables, MDX against OLAP, and increasingly visualization techniques. So what we find is that data analyst or business analyst population, if I had to average it, would be in that 10% range. Some companies would have a higher percentage if there's a lot of IP in the company, tech-centric. There may be more, but typically that's a subset of the business user population, and they have that need for deep analytics, which of course drill down, drill across, drill out. All these drill dimensions are going to be necessary.
But can you break that into two, though, in the sense, I sense that less experienced users, or what you call casual users, may want to drill down into more detail, but that's it. And then as you get the more sophisticated user, they may want to do more OLAP and slicing and dicing.
Correct.
So aren't there two different scenarios here?
Yeah, no, I agree. So when we talk about interactive reports and dashboards, that includes filtering, sorting, that includes drill down, drill through to more details typically, maybe even drill out to a third party, another application. But it doesn't typically include OLAP, deep OLAP style analysis, because that is generally not required by a casual user, but definitely needed by a data analyst.
Okay, good. And just, I guess, one or two, maybe one more question here. And folks, thank you so much for all these great questions. We got several last minute, but we're going a bit long, which we often do because we get good questions. One of the attendees asks, when we talk about in-memory environments, are you seeing the analysis of transactional data OLTP, or the structuring and sharding of data before analysis, like OLAP. I guess he's kind of talking about some CEP here too, right? Complex event processing.
Yeah, it's a real time. I mean, we don't focus a lot on real time, and that does take a special technology. But I think also, if I'm reading into the question, there's a little bit about the preparation required for an OLAP style analysis versus an in-memory paradigm. We support both, so we ship an OLAP server, the open source Mondrian server, which is an OLAP server. And there's some real advantages to that. It's scale, it's pre-aggregated, so great response time, but it does require more setup. So that the user talked about sharding. I don't know if I'd use that term, but it definitely requires more prep. Whereas in memory, the beauty of in memory is you have a lot less prep work. You throw it in memory, but you're also more constrained on size. Because of that. So there's trade-offs, and depending on which is more important to you, setup time or ease of access. Really, those are the two constraints.
Okay, good. And folks, we have burned through 71 minutes already. Very big thank you to both of our presenters today, to Jaspersoft for stepping into the briefing room, for Colin White for his time and attention, and to all of you for your questions. These are always good ones, and they help us really get to the bottom of what this stuff is, how it works, and what you can use it for. That's obviously the goal of the briefing room, is to help you understand exactly what these technologies do and to know when to apply them and when to look somewhere else or when to just build your own stuff. So you can see we have upcoming topics there. July is Disruption Month and Analytics. September is Integration, then Database and Cloud. If you know anyone who wants to step into the briefing room, have them let us know. Get in touch with us. You can get my email from any of the events promotions that go out. And with that, folks, we will wrap up. Thank you again so much for your time and attention. We will archive this webcast at insideanalysis.com, so feel free to hop online. You should be able to go there directly by virtue of what WebEx does when it ends. But if not, just type in insideanalysis.com. With that, we'll bid you farewell, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.